Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our mental health moment today. I'm just going to give everyone a chance to sign on, get themselves settled, and we will be getting started in just a moment. I'm going to take some time to go through some of our admin procedures as folks are signing on and getting settled. So just please note, everyone, that upon joining the webinar today, you've been placed on mute to avoid any background noises. If you would like to activate closed captions for the presentation, you can do so by clicking the button on your toolbar that says live transcript, and then you can select show subtitles. If you encounter any technical issues during today's event, please chat to the host who will be able to assist you. That's that CTAC admin you can see their account. That is my colleague Kiara, and she will be happy to help you. Please, throughout the presentation today, we encourage everyone to use the chat feature to submit questions, comments. We're going to have a Q&A portion where we'll do our best to address as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. And we also would appreciate if at the end of our webinar today, you take some time to fill out a feedback form that will automatically pop up at the end of the webinar. And for those of you who are interested, our recording of this webinar will be posted on our website, the CTAC website, ctacny.org, within 2 to 3 business days. So hope everyone is getting settled. My name is Jackie Garlock. I'm with the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to today's webinar and to welcome our speaker as well. We'll be talking today about the trauma of fat phobia and weight stigma, bias in clinical spaces with youth. And our speaker today is Carmen Cool. Carmen is a politicized therapist, educator, speaker, consultant, and cupcake connoisseur. For the past 23 years, her work has been to help people heal their relationship with food and their bodies, support the next generation of body liberation leaders, and shift the psychotherapy profession toward justice. She is a past board president of the Association for Size, Diversity, and Health, and was named the most inspiring individual in Boulder, Colorado, and was the recipient of the Excellence in Eating Disorder Advocacy Award in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Carmen.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with all of you.
We are so happy to have you here. So today we're going to be talking about weight stigma and fat phobia. And I wanted to just get us started out by asking you sort of how you had come to have an interest in this topic and to sort of specialize in this work.
Yeah, it's a great question. And probably not surprisingly, it came out of my own personal experience. Both my sister and I had eating disorders when we were younger. And of course, eating disorders are so complex and layered and multifactorial, but for both of us, they definitely were the result of trying to be not fat, right? And so dieting that led into something else. And while my sister died from anorexia, sometimes I like to say it's weight stigma that killed her. And so there's a way that from the very beginning, I've been super interested at this intersection of eating disorders and weight stigma. And then there's also something about, like, from my own experience, really getting how much time and energy and life force was being poured into this project of trying to fix my body. And it started really making me angry, right? At what else could that time and energy do if it was put in service of things that I cared about. And so that anger was a catalyst of, like, how do I stop locating the problem inside of me and identifying it as out there in the world that it was affecting me, right? And then also really noticing the way recovery couldn't happen for me unless I could find a way to situate eating disorders in a social justice frame. So specifically, until I could learn to uplift and affirm fatness, recovery was going to be really hard for me. And so this became the area of work that I wanted to spend my time in.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think I'm sure is definitely resonates with me. And I'm sure it resonates with a lot of folks in our audience. I feel like we've already started, I threw out some terms already, and we've talked about terms. There's a lot of terminology, I guess, involved with this area. We have sort of fat phobia, weight stigma. I'm wondering, what are some important terms that or terms that it's important for folks to be aware of when we're talking about this topic?
Great question. One is, you've probably already noticed, I'm going to use the word fat. And so I think we should start there, actually, that fat is being used here as a neutral descriptor of something that we all have on our bodies, away from all of the moral and the moral underpinnings of that word, the shame. Like, it's a reclamation, kind of like queer got reclaimed. There are a lot of people that are saying, why is fat a bad word? So I will use the word fat to describe, I use it in a very neutral way. I know that that's not comfortable for everyone. So, it's an invitation to check, right? What comes up when you hear the word. Fat phobia is an interesting term to think about, because it actually, the definition means an irrational fear of, or hostility to, or disdain for fatness and fat people. But when I think about that definition, I'm not sure it's an irrational fear, given the way we culturally hold fatness. And I'm actually not sure that it's fear, right? The way phobia describes, I think it's more hatred. So I tend to use anti-fat bias these days more than fat phobia, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And so that anti-fat bias is a way that negative attitudes and beliefs about people who are perceived as being fat, right? It operates as a fundamental script that I think we get really early. We're witness to the social currency that thin bodies are afforded. And so that bias can come in there. And then the other word I think we'll probably talk about is weight stigma, right? And that is discrimination or stereotyping based on a person's weight. So that's when we get into the more structural levels of oppression that happens around that.
Yeah. So it seems like when you're talking about anti-fat bias, it's more sort of like those personal internalized beliefs, and then weight stigma being more sort of like how the world does not accommodate people living in, fat bodies.
Yeah. Yeah, right. The way certain bodies are afforded privilege, respect, access to resources, and the way other bodies are not, right, are left out of that.
And one thing I know that you've written about a lot and that you've talked about in other places is actually the way that, weight stigma is one of sort of many of those isms that people that we know that bodies are afforded privilege or lack of privilege in many different, upon many different dimensions. And I'm wondering if you can speak to sort of how weight stigma intersects with other forms of oppression that people might experience.
Sure. I'm going to back that up a little bit, kind of like, and talk about maybe where anti-fat bias and weight stigma comes from.
Yeah.
And talk about the way that intersects. And so, I think most of us probably know that it used to be that being thin was something that represented death, right? Like, it meant tuberculosis, it meant failure to thrive, it meant someone didn't have access to the things that they needed, because food was harder to find, right? Like 18th century, I'm going back quite a ways, and now it's in a way flipped, right? So food is much more accessible. So being thin is what gets privileged and prized. It's like what the hardest thing to obtain is what we hold up as something that's idealized. And I do think fear of death shows up in there some ways. But then Sabrina Strings, who wrote a book called Fearing the Black Fat Body, I might have that wrong, but close. She talks a lot about how fat phobia has its roots in racism, actually. And I think that's not something that has been talked about very much. And, obviously she's going to talk about it way better than I am. But is it interesting to go into that just a little bit?
Yeah, just a little bit, I think would be great.
Yeah. So actually she traces it back to the slave trade, and talked about how I'm going to read what she wrote, if that's okay. She's like, when we're in the colonies, we're noticing that Africans are sensuous. They love sex, they love food, and for this reason, they tended to be fat. Europeans tended to be thought of as having rational self-control. So the thought was that created a hierarchy, right? And so then it became this way that we needed to watch what we eat so we could stay on that hierarchy. And then when the slave trade started and Europeans saw that African women were essentially curvier, it just became a way to sort out. And then once skin color stopped being an easy way to categorize people, because in the slave slave trade, biracial children were starting to be born, then we needed another way actually to be able to place people on a hierarchy. And so it's just fascinating and disturbing the way that fat phobia directly came out of racist roots.
Yeah, it seems like sort of like this association of like what maybe you're getting at, and all what the Sabrina Stringer is getting at is sort of this association of whiteness with sort of like asceticism almost, and sort of denying yourself these like pleasures. I think you were saying something about the sensuousness.
Yeah, I think it in a way has more to do with power, like who
Mm,
has power and how do we sort, right? So
yes.
Sonia Renee Taylor talks a lot about this when she talks about the hierarchy of bodies, right? Like
Mm,
there's a ladder, and the people at the top of the ladder are white, thin, cis, able-bodied humans. Right.
yes.
And then there's this fighting to be on the top of that ladder. But the only way to have access to that power means there's a whole lot of other people that we have to keep down that don't have that same access. So that if, a lot of times the drive for thinness is a drive for access to power and privilege. And of course, right. But that means by definition that other people are going to be denied that.
Yeah. And it seems like these are messages that are, they've obviously persisted in there, as I think you were saying before, they start really young.
Yep.
So we know that folks in our audience are working with youth and families and children. And I'm wondering sort of how do these messages show up when we're talking about young people?
Yeah. I was thinking about this question and my answer was like from the beginning. Because it's, I think we were indoctrinated into this system. It was set up before we were here. Like it's the system that we're born into. And there are there are moms that talk about being in the hospital and having a baby and already being told your baby's too big. Like, or people that make jokes like I've been a Weight Watchers member since the day I was born. And it's a joke, but it's not funny. So I mean it when I say in a way from the very beginning.
Yeah.
That we all know whose bodies are privileged, whose bodies are looked up to, whose bodies are not. Kids know that very early, right?
Yeah. And do you feel like there's a way that it impacts development? I think about like also development of identity. And I think about development, I mean, just to think about sort of my own development, about sort of how I thought about myself, how we think about our bodies is a huge part of how we think about ourselves. And I'm wondering sort of when you think about kids, like, knowing that thinner bodies are privileged, and how does that sort of intersect with how they start to think about themselves?
When young people talk about, I work a lot with teenagers. When they talk about mental health concerns, depression, anxiety, they list as number one, but number two is negative weight perceptions, right? So there's most definitely and belonging is such an important thing for all of us as humans, my goodness, right? But particularly young people, when they're at that stage of development, it's about peer group, it's about wanting a place to belong where they can be themselves. And there's a way that they know what bodies have greater access to belonging than others. I don't know if this is answering the question, but I think it's a big, where dieting is a way to conform, right? Dieting is this thing they're supposed to do. We're supposed to watch our weight. We need, and they're getting the messages, right? With the whole childhood obesity epidemic, I'm going to use that in giant quotation marks, actually, that they're also getting the messages that watching their weight is something that they're supposed to do. That it's a good thing to do, right? And I think about the impacts of what it means to be hungry, to be denying the food that we need, how that impacts a person's learning process, right? Like, yeah, they're trying to get social capital. Of course they are, right? That makes tons of sense. But what does it mean to be going through a school day, not having lunch or being hungry? And maybe there's not food at home. Like there's layers here. There's so many layers, but I think I'm talking specifically around intentional restriction of food in order to change a body size.
Yeah, obviously. And you and I have talked about how there's so many layers when it comes to sort of food insecurity and availability of healthy foods. And also we know that there are a lot of young people that are intentionally restricting their food because of this desire for social capital, for that thin privilege.
Yeah, and we just don't, so many times it can set the stage for the development later of an eating disorder or disordered eating or a fractured relationship with body and sense of self, right? Like, what does it mean when we're denying our body the things that it's actually asking us for? What kind of trust gets broken between ourselves and our intuition, right? All of those things I think deeply matter. What does it mean about, this could overlap into sexual health behaviors, actually, right? Which is a
Yeah.
whole maybe other topic, to be honest. But I think all of our feelings about our bodies are going to play into all of these things: drug use, suicidal ideation, sexual behavior. All of it matters in terms of how we're connected to our bodies or not.
Um, I feel like this is, I'm wondering, you talked about the development of eating disorders. For practitioners who are working with young people who maybe have, where is that line between sort of like disordered eating and eating disorders?
Yeah, there's a way that I want to say I don't know that it matters,
Mm,
honestly, right? Because I think it can set up this system where if it's not a diagnosable eating disorder, it doesn't feel as important. It
yeah.
doesn't feel like it's as deserving of care and support, that it's maybe normative. I'm not going to say it's normal, but I think it becomes normative. And then people are suffering and not getting seen. So I don't really care as much about where it crosses over. I think anyone on that spectrum is suffering and
Needed
deserves.
support.
Yeah, does that make sense?
No, that does make sense. I mean, I think that that's also probably resonates with a lot of folks in the audience who, work with young people just because they don't, qualify for a PTSD diagnosis doesn't mean they're not suffering with the effects of trauma. Just because they're not suffering, diagnostic criteria is one specific measurement, but it doesn't mean that there isn't suffering outside of that.
And then, yeah, so I can go off on this a little bit, and I'll try not to go off too far, but this idea of atypical anorexia, right? So
Mm,
people who are definitely that fit all the criteria for anorexia, except their weight maybe isn't where that threshold is, then they don't get seen, and then they get missed, right?
mm.
Or there was another example I had that I can't remember because, yeah, I'm sorry, maybe it'll come back to me, but oh, just the way that I think it's also, I don't know that there's enough models for what it means to be deeply in touch with our bodies, to fully inhabit them, to have a healthy, life-giving, you know, sustaining relationship with food in our bodies. I think a disordered relationship is what we actually know.
Disordered eating is in some ways the baseline for so many people, especially like in this sort of like I don't know about like United States Western culture that we have sort of, it's the baseline is disordered in a lot of ways.
I think it doesn't start out that way, but I think it can go there, right? Like, what does it mean to eat normally, to eat for pleasure, to eat for nutrition, to move our bodies as a way to feel our life force, as a way to try to change our bodies? What does that mean? And then what does that mean if we're doing those things and our bodies don't fit the ideal? Then how do we reckon with that?
I think about sometimes even just the language we use, right? Like as adults, like I'm having dessert and we say, oh, it's cheat day, right? Or like whenever we enjoy food, there's somehow like an excuse, or I'm gonna have to work this off later. Things that we do to sort of excuse ourselves and or to sort of justify enjoying food.
There was a study that I can't quote the source on because we were talking before this webinar that I'm good at knowing what studies say, but I can't cite them all. It's just not where my brain goes. And it may be an older one, but they showed a piece of chocolate cake to a group of European women and a group of American women and asked the first word that came to mind. And when they showed a group of European women, the first word was pleasure. And when they showed that piece of chocolate cake to American women, the first word was guilt. And I think that matters, right? That also we learn how to disconnect from our pleasure, which is what you were talking about in the beginning. Like we feel guilty. It has these moral underpinnings, cheating, right? That what happened to the ability to just find pleasure in the food that we're having? And then what does it mean if when we're eating, we have this layer of guilt that's hanging around us all the time? I think.
Yeah. And I think about that with for young children or adolescent girls and sort of their association with foods as they grow up. And again, that I think about also like doing that whilst going through puberty and how that the not disruption, but the changing relationships we have with our bodies as we go through puberty. And how does that intersect with how we think about food and nourishing our bodies?
For sure, because I think part of what happens is that for someone who identifies as female, right, that well, actually, how do I want to say this? There are layers here too, actually. So I'm not gonna be able to do this full justice. I just want to say that. Because I was about to use gendered language that I didn't mean, but there is a way that some bodies, how would I say it this way? There's a way that some bodies, when they go through puberty, will gain weight. It's what is supposed to happen. It's developmentally appropriate, but it actually means that then our bodies are going further away from the ideal. And so that creates some kind of a like, my body's doing what it's supposed to do, but I'm fighting it because I don't want it to. And then some bodies during puberty will go towards a cultural ideal. And that's really hard. And then you add doctors, parents, well-meaning humans, of course, that are freaked out actually when weight gain happens and forget that it might for a while. During puberty, during development. Happens again when some bodies are going through menopause, right? And then we fight what our bodies are naturally designed to do on our behalf.
I think about the difference probably between how we treat bodies who gain sort of like adipose tissue as opposed, like, fat, and then bodies who gain sort of like height, right? Like we have, and how those are treated as very different when we're talking about puberty.
Very different. I don't know that we really go up to people and say, you got to do something about those bones. They're, you're over tall. We don't use the word over tall, right? But we use the word overweight, which is a whole other language thing I didn't mention earlier.
And I think a lot of that has to do, well, so I think that sort of is a nice transition to our next, our next sort of, my next question, which I also have seen in somebody sort of reflect in the chat already, which is these associations between weight and health. And I'm wondering what practitioners maybe need to know. And I understand this is a huge topic.
I was telling Jackie before we got on, I can talk for an entire weekend about this topic. So I'm going to be giving maybe just this much, and I can give some resources later. But with the question, what do people need to know about the relationship between weight and health? The first thing that I want to say is what's important to know is we cannot know someone's health status by looking at them. Period. The end. Right? Like we don't know someone's health status by the size of their body. That's stereotyping. That's prejudice. We don't know. I think these automatic associations that get made between weight and health is one of the ways that bias against fat bodies gets to operate. Right? That we look at someone and we think we know something about their health status or what they eat or how they move, and we medicalize a body size and we just don't know. And then some bodies become deviation rather than variation, right? I think health can happen in people across the weight spectrum, right? One argument that I'll use with young people, because they get this pretty quickly and I don't want to oversimplify it, but we know people who are maybe in naturally thin bodies that maybe don't exercise and eat what we consider junk food. I'm going to use that in rabbit ears too. But people in larger bodies that do the opposite. But we would say a thin person is healthy based only by looking on them. And I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts about health and Cheetos. Like that's not what I want to do here. All I saw was something about Kardashians, and I need to stop that because it just distracted me. There is.
We'll get to all the questions at the end, so don't.
Really, I wanted to not. Yes, I think I'm so passionate about this, and I have so much to say. When we make arguments, okay, remember Michelle Obama did a whole thing about childhood obesity, right? And it was about wanting kids to eat better and move more. Can't argue that, but she had the argument on the backs of fat kids, which I think is fundamentally unfair.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like we don't know anybody's health status by looking at them, and then the health argument can devolve a little bit sometimes into like even someone, young person, old person, it doesn't matter if they're in a fat body. In some ways, I don't even care what their health status is. What I want is for everyone to have the same access to dignity and safety in this world, regardless of if they're healthy.
Right.
So that argument matters more to me in these moments. Does that make sense? Oh, there's so much to say about this.
Yeah. So I just, but like, I think like the two important things I'm getting from what you're saying is one, that like someone's size is not a good measurement of their health. We know that
Yes.
the eating healthy foods, and we know that moving our bodies, those are two things that are associated with health from what you were saying, and also those things may, but also probably might not correlate with the size of someone's bodies. And in general, the correlation is not a strong one.
That's exactly right. And I might even say that I don't even use the word healthy food anymore, because it got so, it just is code for thin, for what will make someone thin.
Yes.
Right. And I'm not at all saying that, of course, not all foods have the same nutritional value, but all foods are morally equal.
Yes.
Right. Like murder is bad. Cake's not. Like, let's get the morality out of it.
Right.
And then help someone decide, how do I need to move and eat in a way that gives me
what I need,
that feels life-giving to me and gives me a sense of well-being, not what anyone else says I need to do to achieve an outside definition of health.
And I think that what you said about that, and I see this being sort of being echoed in the chat, that also, regardless of what people's choices are about what they put in their body or how they move their body, that we should all be given the same access to dignity and the same, and should be, afforded the same rights, essentially.
Yep.
I feel like those are two incredibly important things. So what might you say if you have a provider or a parent that comes to a provider that's concerned about their child's weight?
Yeah.
I mean, how might you talk to that person?
I would say context dependent, of course.
Yes, right. This in this imaginary.
I want to say, first, I would say this is challenging, and I would affirm that, right? That nobody gets up and says, how do I mess up my kid around food and weight and body image, right? Like, we want what's best for our kids. And so, of course, this is hard to navigate. How do I help my kid be healthy and not set them up for eating disorders and have a healthy relationship with their body? And it can be really complicated and confusing. So first, I kind of want to metaphorically wrap my arms around that and say, of course, right? Of course, this is hard. But I also want to remind someone that health is not a moral value.
Yeah.
And people can do a lot of very unhealthy things in the name of health. Oh. Right. So I would much rather help people look at how are we helping someone treat their bodies well? How are we helping someone respect their bodies? Not how do we help somebody be thinner to lose weight? Because we know that if everyone eats the same way and moves the same way, we're still going to come in different shapes and sizes. That's called diversity. That's called a good thing. We're not all going to be, it's like asking a Great Dane to be the same size as a poodle or a chihuahua. Like, there's diversity in sizes, and we let that be true for dogs, but we forget that with humans. I also would say the health implications of weight and stigma matter more than what they're having in their lunchbox. Those are the kind, I really would move it around to, how do we help someone show respect and care for their bodies? That might not be satisfying, but that's, okay, sorry, there is a lot more. Here's my plug. This book is what I would recommend. It's called Fat Talk, Parenting in the Age of Diet Culture. I would actually have everyone read this book. She also has a podcast out. So much rich, beautiful information about there, right? Because I think often the question that's well-meaning of how do I help my kid be healthy is I want them to be healthy, but I still also want them to be thin. And Virginia Soul-Smith wrote an essay, said, what if my kid happens to be fat? Okay, I did see that. Someone asked me to put it up again. Should I back it up? Trying to make sure it fits into the screen. And she has a podcast called Burnt Toast, where they talk about all of these things. Yeah, thanks, Jackie, for putting that up there. I'm in love with this book. It's brilliant. That really, in order to help our kids be healthy, we've got to get over our fear of fatness, which is a tough order, but I think that's where we are,
And I really like what you said also about the harm that fat stigma does to people's health, right? If we're really, the concern is for somebody's wellness, then it really is going to be about also avoiding those things that harm people's wellness. And we know that stigma is incredibly harmful to people's wellness.
We can eat I'm going to be really, the book is called Fat Talk. I'm doing your job for you and reading what's coming through on the chat. I'm sorry, just took over. Oh, sorry, there's so much here that I lose my train of thought.
Yes.
What I was going to say is someone can, well, let me back that up. How we eat and how we move, right? So eating well and exercise does not impact our health nearly as much as are we living in poverty? Are we subject to racism? Do we have access to housing? Those matter much more to someone's health status than are we having broccoli at dinner?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think that's an important sort of way to, it's a great, like a very simple way to think about it. I think it's really helpful. I also, I'm wondering sort of, as clinicians, so now I'm sort of going to transition us a little bit to thinking about how this can show up for clinicians in clinical spaces. And I'm wondering I guess one way to sort of start thinking about this is how might a clinician's own bias, because I know we, just like we all like, when we talk about things around racial bias or gender bias or other sort of isms, we know that growing up in a society or living in a society where these are part of our sort of cultural ethos means that we all have these internalized biases. And I'm wondering, how do those potentially show up in clinical spaces for providers?
yeah, how don't they? Right? Like our biases impact everything we do and believe and feel. And so there's a way that we don't often consider this in that same category, right? So first it's just recognizing that we're going to have them, and it's our responsibility and ethic to figure out how they show up. But it can show up around supporting a client's desire for weight loss, right? Like the ways that we can be in collusion with diet culture without knowing it, the ways that all the stereotypes we have around larger bodies that are, we're taught, right? Like lazy, always the first adjective that shows up every single time when we think about stereotypes. Like how much do we believe when a client knocks on our door around and is in a larger body? What are the automatic assumptions that come up?
Yeah,
Right.
why do we think they're there in the first place?
That actually, there are so many studies where when someone comes in a fat body, we in the back of our mind might think weight loss is a goal for treatment or a good outcome for treatment, whether or not that's what they come in for or not, right? So it's looking at all those things. It's looking at I was going to give some examples. Like I have a lot of clients that come to me because other therapists have done past harm, whether they actually recommend, why don't you just do keto for a little while? Why don't you just do weight? Like not our scope of practice, first of all, right? And second, we're just colluding then that if they just fixed the problem of their bodies, they'd be okay. And I'm not here to help someone adjust to oppression, right? Like I'm not here to help someone, like I don't think anyone's body is a problem.
So what
Right.
would you say to a client who comes into your office explicitly asking?
Yeah, honestly, they don't come to my office.
That's fair. That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, they know who I am and what I do. Now, do clients come secretly hoping it'll be an outcome of working together? Sure, right? And I know that's here and I just make a place and welcome it. They don't have to check that desire at the door. But if they're only coming for weight loss, they don't actually come to me. Or if they do, I'll just let them know they're going to be super unsatisfied. Because what I do say is 3 things will happen in the course of our work together. Your body will gain weight, your body will lose weight, or your body will stay the same. Like, I don't know which one will happen. I'm not invested in that. I'm more invested in you having a deeply loving and caring relationship with your own body. What your body does, I trust your body to sort that out. It's not easy, right? But another way I did want to make this point because it feels important. I think another one of those microaggressions that can show up is that we automatically assume that fatness is indicative of trauma. And it might be, but I don't want to start with that assumption, right? I mean, yeah, I think that's another way we want to be careful. Assuming how did somebody get that way? Like rather than, oh, we're all different, right? What happened? Are they emotional eaters? Were there trauma? Maybe, maybe not. I think we just don't want to, I think we need to be careful about that.
I think that's a really good point and one I had not considered, honestly. But we assume that someone's fatness or someone's size is sort of the result of something, and in particularly something that is, quote, like gone wrong, right?
Exactly. Right. Now, maybe, but I think we have to ask really careful questions, you know?
Yeah. And I'm wondering, sort of, now that we've talked about sort of how bias can show up in clinical spaces, are there things that providers can do either to sort of critically reflect on their own biases or deconstruct their own biases, and also to sort of proactively create a inclusive space or a space that promotes sort of body liberation?
Absolutely. Have you all talked about the implicit attitudes test that's online?
No.
Somewhere? Okay. I will send that to you and then you can send out to participants.
Yeah. And we will be posting a resource list for everyone.
Yeah. It might be out of Yale. Suddenly I'm doubting that, but I think it might be. There's a series of implicit bias tests that they have that you can take, and they have them around race, ability, gender, gender expression, and they have size. So I would recommend people take that test, and then you'll see where your biases are, and gently hold that because it's not our fault we have these biases. It's just our responsibility to do something. Our brains are wired for bias. So it can be hard to see the results of those tests sometimes. It was for me. My first time, I'm like, I need to take that test again right now. To prove
I need to pass it.
already right there. But we just have them. So that's one thing people can do. And then just notice, right? When you see someone in a differently sized body, and either on any place on the spectrum, what are the automatic assumptions that we have about their health, about their life, about their love life, about their success? And then there's the really simple thing about how do we set up our spaces? Right? How are we setting up our spaces? Are we communicating an attitude of everybody is welcome here? Do we have furniture that will actually hold different bodies and furniture that they can easily get in of and out of? What does the artwork on our walls represent? What do the books show, right? So that's a basic level. If someone doesn't even feel welcome in our physical space, how are they going to feel emotionally safe? And I think our offices or wherever people are working need to be a place where someone can land and be their true selves. So they want to see themselves reflected in that. Yeah. And that someone has taken the care to and to say, yeah, you're welcome here. You belong here. There's a place for you here. You fit here. You know.
Yeah. And I think that's so important, that you've mentioned both things that are sort of, I mean, I know that folks have varying degrees of control over their physical space based on sort of.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's right.
No, but I think that what I wanted to commend you on is that those are things that you can do regardless of sort of where you're working. You might not be able to obviously always control the furniture, but you can maybe put different artwork up or have different books on your shelf, or different ways of sort of signaling to people that this is an open space to them.
That's right. As well as let people know if there are accessibility concerns. So I work a lot with non-binary and trans clients, and my landlord will not put in a gender affirming bathroom. So I let people know from the very beginning, here's what you can expect about entering the building. Here's what the doors are like. There's an elevator. Here's what the bathrooms are and are not. Here's what the furniture, we can communicate care that way too.
I think transparency is a huge tool of harm reduction, right? We always can always be transparent about what we can and cannot control, and then also give people the agency to make their own choices of sort of about how they navigate spaces based on information.
And the last thing, I'm so sorry, I wanted to throw this in here too about making sure our spaces are inclusive, is watching the language that we use.
Yeah. Tell me more about that.
So when I'm very thoughtful and careful about the words that I use to describe bodies, and I'm aware that my clients will come in with their own language, but it also matters to me that I'm not using the same language all the time. So I won't use the word overweight ever. I also will never use the word obese, because that's just a medicalization of a body size, and nobody wants all the negative associations we have attached to them, right? And it's not a neutral word. But I won't use the word overweight, right? Because every time I hear it, I think over what weight? Like over what exactly? The weight the BMI chart says we're supposed to be. The BMI chart is is a word I won't say. The BMI chart's not helpful. It's not accurate. It doesn't matter. Do I mean that? Yeah, actually, I mean that. Right. So just being inclusive with our language around body sizes. I might ask a client what word they prefer. Or I might just explain, here's what I'm not gonna, I hear you use that word and I'm not gonna use it back, and here's why. Yeah.
I think that's really important. It's both sort of like meeting people where they are and modeling,
That,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, I love
Sometimes
that.
it's tricky, but I think we communicate something when we do that.
Do you feel like it's important for providers to think about, especially providers that, to think about our own body size and our own privilege or oppression that comes with living in bodies of, whatever size our body is and how that functions?
Yeah, of course, right? I think our bodies matter. If we're supporting, well, not just our body size, but our behaviors. So if we're supporting body liberation, but we're also dieting, or there's a Diet Coke on our, like, let's just be, I think that matters too, that we also need to look at, oh, well, how am I treating my body? Am I saying one thing, but doing another in my own life? That's one place of inquiry that we can engage in. And then sure, if we're in a thin body and there's someone in our space that's in a larger body, we're representing something, right? And vice versa. If we're in a larger body, right, we're gonna get projections on us anyway about our body size. So it's just being aware that if I have access to more privilege because of the size of my body, I want to name that in the room. Just like if I'm white, right, and if I'm working with a client of color, I'm going to name that from the get-go, right? And so it's like, how do we navigate that? And so if someone is in a smaller body, have you thought about the way thin privilege shows up in your life? Have you thought about what you have access to that maybe not everyone does, that we take for granted because it's unexamined, right? The right to walk into a store and buy clothes off the rack, or the right to not worry about getting on an airplane, or the right to be shopping in a grocery store and not have somebody stare at what's in your cart. There are lots of things that smaller bodies have access to that maybe we don't even consider.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that I've already asked you a little bit about sort of like responding to clients or young people that maybe want to lose weight, or parents who want their child to be thinner. I also was thinking about, if we think about supporting clients in managing that sort of internalized anti-fat bias. And I think, one of the things I automatically would think of is sort of that sort of traditional CBT approach of like, think positive thoughts about your body or identify unhelpful thoughts about your body. And I think that that's probably a place that a lot of our practitioners sort of are familiar with that approach.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it seems like a great place to start maybe, but it seems like maybe that there is more that folks can do to help clients who may have sort of be sitting with that, especially, our young people that are sitting with those internalized thoughts about their bodies.
Yeah. I think, I have to sit up, right? Because I just noticed my posture change. There's so much around all of this. I think I believe that if someone changes their thoughts about their bodies, it still doesn't do anything around the fact that they walk around in a world that's hostile to them. So it just doesn't. We can't love our body enough to get out of structural oppression also, right? So especially with young people who, in my experience, they actually don't want to think that they're conforming to anything, right? I use that really strategically here. It's helpful, So sometimes I'll kick up that rebel that's automatically in them, but also helping them question, okay, right? What is it that you really want in the pursuit of weight loss? It might be a thinner body, but what is it that thinner body gives you that you don't have now that you're actually wanting? And let's go get that some other way, right? So what is it that you're actually desiring that you believe thinness promises you? The other thing that I'll help them think about is who benefits? Who benefits from you pursuing weight loss? Who's making money? Who's making money off you? Like that usually engages some anger or some, like, oh, so a lot of people have a lot of stake in you not feeling okay about yourself and wanting to change, right? Those questions can be helpful. Also, I think there is some some way that when they think about, hang on, what do I want to say about that? Who's left out can
Yeah.
also be another way. Who's left out of the definition of health, right? Who's left, who has access to the pursuit to dieting? Like there's just so many layers of justice that show up in there that helping people think about that critically too.
Yeah.
I know
I
that's
think,
a really short answer. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, to a very big question, but those are some of the go-tos that, and I'll also validate, of course you want to lose weight because all you're being told is that's going to be the answer to everything. But let's think that through. With adults, it's a little easier in some ways because they've had enough experience of trying to diet to know that it actually doesn't really deliver what it promises, but young people don't know that.
right.
So like thinking that through, who's telling you you're not okay as you are?
No, that's really interesting. As somebody who's been at a variety of different weights, right? Like I've lived my life at different weights, knowing that that assumption that I had when I was a young person that living in a thinner body would make me happier. At some point, you get enough experience to realize maybe that you realize, oh, like I'm just as happy or unhappy now as I was 10 pounds ago, 20 pounds ago, or whenever. But when you're a young person, you don't have necessarily that kind of same experience. And so helping them to sort of parse out, I equate thinness with lovability, I equate thinness with power or control over my own life, or I equate thinness with, acceptance.
I think what you said was just it, and I was going to say it. Like I can get so angry about the way we're taught to try to have control over our bodies, about the way I get angry about all of this. Any system that says somebody is not worthy makes me really upset. But there's also, I have to remember when someone, we all just want to be loved is what I want to say. Like, that's just what we want. And it's like, oh my gosh, of course we do. We need that.
Yeah.
It's just, it gets confusing if we think that having a smaller body is the access to being loved. We're set up to have a struggle, right?
Yeah.
Some ways, because our bodies are going to be changing throughout the course of our lifetimes. And if
Yeah.
lovability is dependent on only one physical only one way of being in our bodies, then there's a lot that's coming, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit we had a lot of amazing questions in the
Great.
chat.
Great.
So I'm going to take some of them. We definitely are not going to have time for all of the questions, but I just wanted to share with our audience that Carmen has very generously offered to take the questions that we don't have time for and answer those in a sort of a written form. And we will be posting that along with the recording and along with a sheet of resources, including the ones that Carmen named during the presentation today. So you can all expect to see that on the website alongside the recording. So I'm wondering, so we had a question that came in once or twice about, and I think you sort of covered this a little bit already, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to sort of this idea that body positivity or being accepting of all bodies promotes like unhealthiness or promotes obesity. Yeah. I'm wondering sort of if there's like a quick way to sort of respond to that when folks are presented with that argument.
It's a big one. Depends on which version of me is going to answer that on any given. There's a snarky version. There's a snarky that can show up. It's like, what's wrong with promoting that we come in all different shapes and sizes, right? Like body positivity. Oh, this is another hour. I gave a lecture once to a group of social workers and they're like, let me get this straight. You help young people love themselves as they are? I'm like, yeah. And they said, you're dangerous. That's dangerous. And I thought about it for a second, right? Like, actually, they're right. Because a bunch of young people in this world walking around knowing that they're fine as they are, that is a dangerous thing, right? To the existing structures of power. What we're promoting, if anything, is, oh, this is such a big question. Hang on. I need a little bit of a second. Well, there are just so many pieces in there. Like, mostly this idea that there's a way to hate ourselves into health,
Yes.
So if we're accepting of ourselves, then we're just going to let ourselves go. We're going to sit on the couch and eat chocolate all day. We're not going to care about our bodies or our health anymore. That just isn't what happens. I've
Right.
never known hate as a path to health, just
Right.
like I've never known war as a path to peace.
Right. It's like this idea that shaming works when we know that it
Doesn't
just
work.
doesn't.
I'm glad you said that actually. The therapist I had, I think it's been 30 years since I was in treatment for my eating disorder. It's been a really long time. Her name was Susan Woolley, and she said, if shame could cure obesity, there wouldn't be a fat person left in the world.
That's so
Shame
powerful.
does not motivate behavior change. It doesn't. Shame and fear doesn't. Love does. Care does. Respect does. So those are the things that I help cultivate.
Yeah.
Again, no
Um,
one knows more to that question that I'm going to speak to in this moment.
yeah. I'm wondering, so someone asked about specifically about First Nations people, but I'm wondering, I think that what they're sort of asking about, gets to sort of like our current way of eating versus sort of like more holistic ways of eating. And I'm wondering if you could sort of speak to those, sort of like the idea about food as sort of nourishing versus the way we think about food now.
You know what, how I'm going to answer that actually, honestly, is I'm going to ask everyone to come to Gloria Lucas's lecture that's coming up, because I think she is much better situated to answer this question than I am.
I love it when we plug future CTAC offerings
Yeah,
during.
she can do that in a way that I'm not going to be able to very well. Yeah.
Yes. We'll be announced, we'll show a slide with the information in just a couple minutes, but we are going to be having an upcoming offering that talks about decolonization of eating disorder treatment. And so we really encourage everyone to come to that. It's next week. And I think maybe you'll have sort of a similar reaction to this next question, but I think it also is something that you can maybe speak to, is sort of like intergenerational perceptions of weight, and sort of, especially when we have folks who are dealing with multi-generational family systems.
Yeah.
How do you see the perceptions of weight sort of being transferred, and then how does that how does that impact how you intervene with that family?
You all ask really good questions that deserve so much more time. Is first what I want to just say. These are such good questions. You know, I have a mother, my mom is almost 80 and is still worried about how many calories are in the meals that she gets, right? So there are these ways that it gets passed down, right? She grew up on, I don't want to make it about her. Generationally, there are different, Richard Simmons, Weight Watchers, Jane Fonda, that's how I grew up. Fresca, Tab, oh my God, right? That's how I grew up. And so it was just normative, right? I do struggle sometimes with the pain and of seeing how things are getting passed down, and acknowledging the suffering that without placing blame, right? Because of course it happens that way, but unless we all do the work to unlearn, there's a lot of unlearning in this work, right? You have to unlearn all the things that we've felt that's true, that we've been taught. Again, I don't know if I'm speaking directly to the question. I'm just kind of going off stream of consciousness, what I'm originally thinking, or first thought, maybe.
No, I think that that really does speak to this idea that like, it's not just about addressing sort of like the ideas itself, but where do those ideas come from? And then thinking about where those messages come from, like how are these messages transmitted over time? And then what does that mean for how we unlearn them?
And different families will have different cultural beliefs and values and ideas around this too. And I certainly am not in a position to speak to all of those, but in certain families, being thin means you're better able to find love, which is what we want, and then what we want for our kids. And so, I always assume a positive intention in these things that are happening, right? Always. Yeah, of course, that's what we want. Nobody wants our kid to be subject to ridicule and teasing. And if parents have had that experience, we want to spare that for our kids, and then we don't realize what we're doing instead sometimes. Yeah.
But I love this idea of like assuming that this is coming from a place of love, because I think, at least in my experience working with families and in my own life, like that is where it's coming from. And as a provider, helping families to tap into that, you just want your child to
Right.
find love the way that you did, or you just want your child to find, autonomy and happiness in the way that you did, or that you were able to, or maybe you were not able to.
Um,
And
and then
then
here's
thinking
a
about supporting that.
yeah, a little bit of a delay means I'm interrupting and I don't mean to. And then helping, here's a way you can show that, right? Without inadvertently, of course, giving a different message, which is that you're not okay as you are, right?
Yes, yes. I'm looking at the time. We have a couple more questions. I'm also making, these are all, like, as you were saying, people are asking some really big and intense questions. So I think some of these I'm going to sort of save, and hopefully we'll be able to address them in a written way. I guess I'll just sort of close with this one, which is sort of, how do you begin these conversations with young people, right? In terms of, is there sort of a way that you suggest sort of broaching these topics with young people, especially to young people who maybe are bringing in things but not speaking directly to it?
I ask almost every young person, hey, maybe not the first session, but it depends on, what's happening between them and I. How you feel about your body? Like, just let's just make it okay to talk about how you feel about your body,
Yeah.
And see where they go. If and understanding that our relationships with our bodies are vulnerable, they're private, they're wrapped up with identity. There's a lot there. So if there's not a doorway for a while, that's really okay. But I'll just drop little things in to make it known that it's really okay to talk about.
Yeah.
How do you feel about your body? Where do you think, where'd you get? Sometimes I have colleagues from the Center of Body Trust, which will also be in the resource list, around helping them understand where their own body story and where it came from.
Yeah.
Hey, how did the feelings about your body start? What can you tell me? When was the first experience you had of feeling like maybe something wasn't quite right? And if they don't want to talk about it, that's okay with me too, for a while.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Carmen. This was incredibly helpful. I think that this has really been echoed by folks in the chat, that it seems like this is really salient information for people. As you were saying, we will be putting out a resource list, and then also answering some of these questions that we didn't have time for.
Yeah.
I also want to, you already thank you for plugging our next, some of our next events. We have an event coming up, and Kara, I'm wondering if we could share the slides real quick again, just to show people our upcoming events.
Yes, 1 second.
No worries.
I just want to say it's been a total pleasure to be in conversation with you.
Yeah, this has been really great. I feel like I've learned so much, and I also feel like, yeah, and I'm seeing this echoed in the chat. People are saying this has, been so helpful for them. So I'm glad that it's felt good for everybody. It felt good for me too.
Right.
We're going to be continuing sort of this conversation to some degree. We're talking specifically more about eating disorders, but connecting that with historical trauma and harm reduction, and specifically looking at Black, Indigenous, and youth of color. That's going to be next week, June 5th. It's going to be from 3 to 4 p.m. We hope folks will join us. We also have other upcoming offerings. We have supporting family peer advocacy in response to bullying coming up on June 8th. And then also supporting transgender youth in New York State coming up on June 22nd. You can find all of our offerings listed on the CTAC website. We have a calendar there with all of our upcoming events. So we really encourage people to always look there. Someone asked about the recordings for this. This will be up in 2 to 3 business days, along with those resources we mentioned. And thank you all so much. Please take some time to fill out the survey that will pop up as you exit the webinar. And thank you all so much for attending, and hope everyone has a great rest of your week.
So pleasurable hanging out with all of you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.